March 15, 1992, Atlantic City Convention Center. Eddie Torino had been fixing fights for 2 years to pay his daughter's medical bills. Tonight was supposed to be his last job. He sent Maria Santos into Mike Tyson's locker room with one instruction: keep Iron Mike distracted for 10 minutes. She was 24, scared, and desperate for the $1,000 Eddie promised. What happened in that locker room changed everything. Tyson didn't touch her. He didn't even look at her twice. Instead, he asked her one question that made her break down crying. Security cameras caught it all. The FBI had been watching. And Maria Santos wasn't just some girl from the casino floor. She was Agent Maria Santos. And she'd been hunting Eddie for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gym smelled like 30 years of sweat and broken dreams. Eddie Torino wiped down the heavy bag with the same methodical precision he'd used since 1995, when he'd bought this place with what remained of his savings after the lawyers finished bleeding him dry. The FBI investigation had cleared him of criminal charges. Barely, but it had cost him everything else that mattered. His hands shook as he folded the towel. They'd been shaking for months now, ever since the doctor mentioned Parkinson's. Just a tremor, nothing definitive yet, but Eddie knew his body better than any physician. He was running out of time, and there were still things that needed fixing. The bell above the door chimed. Eddie didn't look up. Kids from the neighborhood wandered in sometimes, drawn by the faded posters of champions who'd trained here in the early days, before his reputation became toxic, before the boxing world decided Eddie the Professor Torino was a cautionary tale best forgotten. "We're closed," he called out, continuing to wipe down equipment that was already clean. "I'm not here to train." The voice stopped him cold. Female, confident, with just a trace of an accent he couldn't place. Eddie turned slowly, and the towel slipped from his fingers. She was maybe 45 now, with silver threading through black hair and lines around eyes that had seen too much. But he recognized her immediately. Those same dark eyes that had stared back at him from newspaper photos during the trial. The same face that had haunted his sleep for 3 decades. Agent Santos. His voice came out as a whisper. Just Maria now. She stepped further into the gym, her gaze sweeping over the worn equipment and cracked mirrors. "I left the bureau years ago." Eddie's chest tightened. His right hand moved instinctively toward the baseball bat he kept behind the counter, but Maria raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to arrest you, Eddie. That ship sailed a long time ago." She moved closer, and he could see the exhaustion in her face, the weight of years that matched his own. "I'm here because someone's been asking questions about Atlantic City, about that night." The memories crashed over him like a rogue wave. His daughter Sarah in the hospital bed, tubes snaking from her tiny arms, the bills mounting higher than his mortgage, the phone call from Vincent Calabrese offering him a way out, just this once, just enough to cover the treatments. Sarah needed surgery, he said, the old excuse tasting like ash in his mouth. The experimental treatment wasn't covered by insurance. I was desperate. "I know." Maria's voice was gentler than he deserved. "I've read your file more times than I can count. I know about the bills, the second mortgage, the loan sharks circling. I know you thought you were saving your daughter's life, but you were there to destroy mine." She flinched, and for a moment the federal agent facade cracked. "I was 24 and terrified. That was my first undercover assignment. I thought I was hunting a big-time fight fixer, some criminal mastermind. Instead, I found a desperate father trying to save his little girl." Eddie remembered that night in perfect detail. How Maria had knocked on the locker room door, nervous and stammering about being a reporter. How Tyson had taken one look at her and asked the question that changed everything. "Why are you really here, sweetheart? And don't lie to me. I can smell fear, and yours isn't the right kind." That's when she broke. Confessed everything to Iron Mike himself, sobbing about being in over her head, about how the trainer who sent her seemed like a good man caught in a bad situation. Tyson had listened, then walked out and knocked out his opponent in the first round anyway, because as he told the press later, "I don't need distractions to win fights." "Sarah never spoke to me again after the trial," Eddie said. Couldn't handle having a criminal for a father, even one who did it for her. She's a doctor now. Lives in California with her family. Sends Christmas cards with no return address. Eddie Maria's voice carried an urgency that made him look up. Someone's been digging into old bureau files, specifically files related to boxing corruption in Atlantic City circa 1992, files that were supposed to be sealed permanently. A chill ran down his spine. What kind of someone? The dangerous kind. The kind with resources and connections and reasons to want certain people silenced. She moved closer, and he could see the fear in her eyes now. I think Vincent Calabrese's old organization is cleaning house, tying up loose ends. Vincent died in prison 10 years ago. His nephew didn't. Anthony Calabrese is running things now, and he's got ambitions, political ambitions, the kind that don't survive corruption scandals from 30 years ago. Eddie felt the walls of his small world closing in. He'd thought he'd paid his debt, served his time in the wilderness of a ruined reputation. But the past never stayed buried, not really. It just waited underground until someone decided to start digging. Eddie's legs gave out, and he sank onto the nearest bench. The weight of 3 decades pressed down on his shoulders like a loaded barbell. Around him, the gym seemed to pulse with memories. Young fighters throwing combinations at heavy bags, the rhythmic slap of speed bags, the encouraging shouts of trainers who believed in second chances. All of it felt fragile now, like a soap bubble waiting to pop. "How much time do we have?" he asked, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. Maria pulled out a chair from behind the front desk, the metal legs scraping against the concrete floor. The sound echoed in the empty space, sharp and final. "I don't know. Could be days, could be weeks. But Eddie, if they're really cleaning house—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Eddie's trembling hand reached for the framed photograph on the windowsill, the only personal item he allowed himself in this place. Sarah, at 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a medal from some long-forgotten school track meet. Her hair was just starting to grow back then, wispy and uneven, but her eyes blazed with life. The doctors had said the experimental treatment worked. His deal with the devil had saved her life, even if it had cost him her love. "She's got kids now," he said quietly. "Twins, boy and girl. I've never met them." Maria followed his gaze to the photograph. "What are their names?" "Michael and Elena." The names felt foreign on his tongue, like speaking a language he'd never been taught. "I only know because Sarah's colleague mentioned them at a medical conference. Dr. Sarah Chen now." She took her husband's name. He set the frame down carefully, as if it might shatter. Smart move. The Torino name doesn't open doors anymore. The late afternoon light slanted through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the gym floor. Outside, Atlantic City hummed with its familiar mixture of hope and desperation. Tourists feeding slot machines, street vendors hawking knockoff merchandise, teenagers with nowhere else to go lingering on street corners. This neighborhood had seen better days, but so had Eddie. They'd found a comfortable rhythm together, the broken-down trainer and the broken-down city. Maria stood and walked to the wall of faded fight posters. Her fingers traced the edge of one, Tommy Martinez, a lightweight who'd trained here for 3 years before Eddie's reputation became too toxic for any serious fighter to risk association. Tommy had gone on to win a regional title with another trainer. Eddie had watched the fight on a grainy bar television, nursing a beer and pretending his heart didn't break every time the commentators mentioned Tommy's new and improved corner. "I never got to thank you," Maria said without turning around. "Thank me?" Eddie's laugh was bitter. "For what? Destroying your career too? For trying to protect me that night. When Tyson figured out what was happening, you could have thrown me under the bus, blamed everything on the overeager federal agent who'd gone rogue. Instead, you took full responsibility." Eddie remembered. In the chaos after Tyson's first-round knockout, when the FBI descended and the media circus began, he'd had a choice. Maria had looked so young, so terrified, standing in handcuffs next to agents who were already distancing themselves from the operation. He could have painted her as a loose cannon, an agent who'd pushed him into something he'd never wanted to do. But he'd looked at her and seen Sarah. Someone's daughter, Someone's hope for the future, about to be ground up by forces bigger than herself. "You were just a kid," he said. "Kids make mistakes. Parents," he gestured around the empty gym, "parents should know better." The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sounds of traffic and the occasional shout from the street. Eddie could smell the Chinese restaurant next door preparing for the dinner rush, the familiar blend of garlic and ginger that had become the soundtrack to his solitude. "There's something else," Maria said finally. "The files they're looking at, they don't just contain evidence of the fight fixing. There are financial records, wire transfers, bank accounts. If Anthony Calabrese is running for state senate like the rumors suggest, he needs a clean slate." Eddie nodded slowly. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture he didn't want to see. And anyone who can connect him to his uncle's organization becomes a liability. Not just a liability, Eddie, a target. The gym's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting intermittent shadows across the walls. Eddie thought about the life he'd built here, small, quiet, and safe. He thought about the kids from the neighborhood who still sometimes wandered in despite his reputation, looking for someone to teach them how to throw a proper jab or just to listen when the world got too heavy. He thought about the bodega owner next door who still nodded good morning, and the mailman who knew to leave packages with the restaurant when the gym was closed. It wasn't much of a life, but it was his. And now someone wanted to take even that away. Maria was about to respond when the old rotary phone behind the counter rang. The harsh metallic sound cut through the gym like a fire alarm, making them both freeze. Eddie stared at the black device, its presence suddenly ominous. Nobody called the gym anymore. His few remaining bills came by mail, and the kids from the neighborhood just showed up when they felt like it. The phone rang again, then again. "Don't answer it," Maria said, but Eddie was already moving. 3 decades of discipline died hard, and the phone had always been answered in his gym. He lifted the heavy receiver, the familiar weight cold against his ear. Torino's. Silence. Then breathing, deliberate and measured. "Eddie, the Professor Torino." The voice was smooth, cultured, with a kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. "I've been looking forward to this conversation." Eddie's blood turned to ice water. He'd heard that voice before, though deeper now, aged like expensive wine. Anthony Calabrese had inherited more than just his uncle's organization. He'd inherited Vincent's particular brand of polite menace. Anthony. Eddie gripped the receiver tighter, his knuckles going white. "It's been a long time. 30 years, 2 months, and 16 days. But who's counting?" A soft chuckle. "I was just a teenager when you helped my uncle with that little problem in Atlantic City. Learned a lot watching how he handled business back then." Maria moved closer, her face tense with recognition. She could hear both sides of the conversation in the gym's hollow acoustics. "I paid my debt," Eddie said. "The FBI investigation, the trial, losing everything. I served my time." "Oh, Eddie, you misunderstand. This isn't about old debts." The voice carried a note of genuine amusement now. "This is about new opportunities. You see, I'm running for state senate, and my campaign manager, brilliant woman, Harvard MBA, she's very thorough about opposition research. Cleaning the slate, as it were." Eddie's mouth went dry. "What do you want?" "I want to offer you a gift, a chance to see your daughter again." The words hit Eddie like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, nearly dropping the phone. Maria caught his arm, her eyes wide with alarm. "I don't know what you're talking about," Eddie managed. "Dr. Sarah Chen, pediatric oncologist at Cedars-Sinai. Beautiful family. Those twins of hers are adorable. Michael's got your eyes, you know. Plays Little League, third base just like his grandfather used to." The casual tone made the threat even more terrifying. "Elena's a dancer, takes ballet every Thursday at 4 p.m. Very talented for a 7-year-old. Eddie's vision blurred. His free hand groped for the counter, desperate for something solid to hold on to. "Leave them alone. They have nothing to do with this." "You're absolutely right. They don't. Which is why this conversation is going to stay between us." The voice hardened slightly. "You and I both know there are certain files that could be embarrassing if they became public. Financial records, wire transfers, details about how a desperate father made a deal with the devil to save his little girl. The FBI already investigated all of that. There's nothing new. There's always something new, Eddie. Agent Santos there. Yes, I know she's with you. She's been very careless about who she's talked to lately. Asking questions, digging through old files, making people nervous. That's not healthy behavior. Maria grabbed the phone from Eddie's hand. This is Maria Santos. If you think you can intimidate... Ah, the famous Agent Santos. Though I suppose it's just Maria now, isn't it? Lost your badge, your pension, your credibility. All because you fell for a sob story about a sick little girl. The voice carried mock sympathy. How's that working out for you? The private security gig, the one-bedroom apartment in Newark, the bottle of wine you need every night just to sleep? Maria's face went pale. How do you... I make it my business to know things, Maria. Just like I know Eddie's been taking medication for early-stage Parkinson's. Just like I know his daughter sends those Christmas cards from different post offices so he can't track her down. Just like I know you've been carrying around guilt for 30 years, wondering if you could have handled things differently. The phone line crackled with static, and for a moment the only sound was their labored breathing. Here's what's going to happen, Anthony continued. You're both going to disappear. Tonight. Eddie, you're going to close your little gym, pack a bag, and take a nice long vacation, somewhere far away. Maria, you're going to stop asking questions about files that don't concern you anymore. Eddie found his voice. And if we don't? Then tomorrow morning, the Atlantic City Press is going to receive a very interesting package. Photos, documents, recordings. The complete story of how Eddie, the Professor Torino, fixed the biggest fight of his career, and how a federal agent helped cover it up. By evening, it'll be national news. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Eddie's small world, already cracked and fragile, finally shattered completely. The dial tone buzzed like a dying insect. Eddie stared at the receiver in his hand, his mind refusing to process what had just happened. Maria gently took the phone and set it back in its cradle, the click unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. We need to leave, she said, but her voice sounded distant, underwater. Eddie, we need to leave right now. Eddie remained frozen, his gaze fixed on the framed photograph of Sarah. Anthony's words echoed in his skull. Michael's got your eyes. Elena's a dancer. Every Thursday at 4 p.m. The specificity was a scalpel, precise and cutting. This wasn't a bluff. Someone had been watching his grandchildren, children whose faces he'd never seen except in his imagination. Eddie! Maria's voice was sharper now. She grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. Did you hear me? We have to go. Where? The word came out as a croak. He knows everything. Where Sarah lives, where she works, where my grandchildren go to school. Eddie's hands began to shake, the tremor more pronounced than usual. There's nowhere to run from that kind of reach. Maria moved to the front window and peered through the grimy glass, her body tense. Maybe not, but staying here is suicide. She turned back to him. Pack whatever you need. We'll figure out the rest later. But Eddie couldn't move. The gym around him felt like a tomb now, filled with the ghosts of better decisions. He thought about the phone call from Vincent Calabrese 30 years ago, how it had seemed like salvation at the time. Just one fight, Eddie. Just enough to cover the medical bills. The same reasonable tone, the same civilized menace that Anthony had inherited like a family heirloom. I should have known, Eddie whispered. When Vincent died in prison, I should have known someone would take his place. These people don't just disappear. Maria was checking her watch, her movements sharp and efficient. Anthony's not like his uncle. Vincent was old school, brutal but predictable. Anthony went to Princeton, spent 2 years at Goldman Sachs before coming back to Atlantic City. He's got political ambitions and the intelligence to achieve them, which makes him more dangerous. Much more. She moved away from the window. The old crew, they'd just put a bullet in your head and dump you in the Pine Barrens. Anthony's playing a longer game. He wants us discredited first, then eliminated. Clean and deniable. Eddie finally forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady. The Parkinson's medication was wearing off, and stress always made the symptoms worse. His right hand curled involuntarily, the tremor impossible to hide now. How long have you been watching me? He asked suddenly. Maria paused in her surveillance of the street. What? You said someone was asking questions about the old files. But you knew where to find me. You knew about the Parkinsons. How long have you been watching me, Maria? The question hung between them like an accusation. Maria's face flushed, and she looked away. Does it matter now? It matters to me. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the window frame. 3 years, she said finally. Ever since I left the bureau, I've been keeping tabs on you, making sure you were okay. Why? Because I destroyed your life. The words came out raw, unfiltered. Because every time I looked in the mirror, I saw that terrified trainer who just wanted to save his daughter. Because I've spent 30 years wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Eddie absorbed this information, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. You've been protecting me. Trying to. I still have contacts in the bureau, people who owed me favors. When Anthony started making inquiries about old boxing corruption cases, one of them tipped me off. She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I came here to warn you, but I was too late. He already knows everything. The sound of a car engine drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a black sedan pulling up across the street. The windows were tinted, but Eddie could make out the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. The engine idled, patient and menacing. Friends of yours? Eddie asked, his mouth dry as sand. Maria's face went pale. No, definitely not friends. She grabbed Eddie's arm, back door, now. But as they turned toward the rear of the gym, Eddie heard another car door slam from the alley behind the building. They were boxed in, trapped like rats in his own sanctuary. The basement, Eddie said. There's a utility tunnel that connects to the building next door. Prohibition-era smuggling route. They moved quickly toward the narrow stairs, but Eddie's trembling hands struggled with the light switch. In the darkness below, 30 years of accumulated fear waited to swallow them whole, revealing a cramped space that smelled of mildew and forgotten time. Eddie's trembling fingers found the wall switch as footsteps echoed above them, heavy boots crossing the gym floor with deliberate purpose. Maria pressed herself against the concrete wall, her breathing shallow and quick. Where's the tunnel? She whispered. Eddie pointed toward the far corner where old training equipment had been stacked like tombstones. Behind a rusted punching bag, barely visible in the dim light, was a narrow opening that looked like it led to hell itself. They moved toward it, but Eddie's legs gave out halfway across the room. He caught himself against a support beam, his medication-addled muscles betraying him at the worst possible moment. I can't, he gasped. The Parkinsons. Stress makes it worse. Above them, a voice called out, calm, professional. Mr. Torino? We know you're here. We just want to talk. Maria grabbed Eddie's arm, hauling him upright. Like hell they do. She pulled him toward the tunnel entrance, but he resisted, his face ashen in the yellow light. Maria, stop. This is insane. Eddie's voice cracked with desperation. They're not going away. Anthony Calabrese doesn't make empty threats, and running will only make it worse for Sarah and the kids. So what's your alternative? Walk upstairs and let them put a bullet in your head? Eddie stared at the tunnel opening, seeing not escape but another 30 years of running. Maybe that's what I deserve. Maybe that's what I've deserved all along. The words hit Maria like a physical blow. She spun to face him, her eyes blazing. You think your daughter would want that? You think those grandchildren you'll never meet would be better off with their grandfather murdered in some basement? They're better off without me, period. Eddie's voice was barely audible now. Sarah was right to cut me out. Everything I touch turns to poison. Above them, the footsteps had stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the noise. It meant they were planning, coordinating, preparing for whatever came next. You want to know the real reason I've been watching you for 3 years? Maria's voice shook with emotion she'd kept buried for decades. Because you're the only person who ever tried to protect me. Not just that night with Tyson, but afterward. During the investigation, the hearings, when the Bureau hung me out to dry, you could have destroyed me completely, and you didn't. Eddie looked up at her, confusion replacing despair. What are you talking about? The wire transfers, Eddie. The financial records Anthony mentioned on the phone. Maria's face was pale, but her voice grew stronger. You think the FBI investigation found everything? You think they uncovered every detail of how Vincent Calabrese paid you? A cold understanding began to creep over Eddie's features. Maria, what did you do? I buried the worst of it. The payment records that would have implicated Sarah's doctors, the hospital administrators who looked the other way, evidence that could have destroyed the experimental cancer program that saved not just your daughter's life, but dozens of other kids. Her hands were shaking now. I falsified reports, misfiled documents, made evidence disappear. I committed federal crimes to protect people I'd never met. The basement seemed to shrink around them, 30 years of buried truth pressing down like a physical weight. Eddie stared at Maria as if seeing her for the first time. The Bureau found out, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Eventually. Not the details, but enough. They couldn't prove I'd destroyed evidence, but they knew something was wrong. That's why I really lost my badge. Not because I went rogue on the Tyson operation, but because they suspected I'd covered for you afterward. Above them, a new sound. Someone testing the basement door, the old hinges creaking ominously. So when Anthony talks about files that could embarrass him, Eddie said, the pieces finally clicking together, he's not just talking about fight fixing. He's talking about a cancer treatment program that was funded with dirty money. Money from his uncle's organization. Money that saved lives. Maria's voice was fierce now, including Sarah's, including those other children. That's what I've been protecting all these years. Not you, not me, but them. The basement door opened with a squeal of rusted metal. Light from the gym above spilled down the narrow stairs, and footsteps began to descend. Eddie looked at the tunnel entrance one more time, then back at Maria. If we run, he said slowly, and they can't find us to silence us, what happens to Sarah? What happens to the kids in that cancer program who are still alive because of treatments that dirty money made possible? Maria's face crumpled as she understood. They become leverage, collateral damage. The footsteps were halfway down the stairs now. Eddie straightened up, his tremor subsiding as terrible clarity settled over him. There's nowhere to run from this, is there? There never was. Eddie stepped forward, placing himself between Maria and the stairs as the first figure emerged into the basement's sickly light. But instead of the hired muscle he'd expected, a woman in an expensive charcoal suit descended the steps with careful precision. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that came from decades of making life-or-death decisions. "Agent Santos," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent Eddie couldn't place. "Professor Torino, I'm Deputy Director Catherine Walsh, FBI. We need to talk." Maria's face went white. "Kathy, what the hell are you doing here?" "Cleaning up a mess that's been festering for 30 years. Walsh reached the bottom of the stairs and surveyed the basement with distaste. "Though I have to admit, you picked an appropriately dramatic venue for this conversation." Eddie's mind reeled. "You're FBI?" But Anthony said, "Anthony Calabrese says many things. Most of them are lies designed to serve his own interests." Walsh moved closer, and Eddie could see the weariness in her eyes. "He doesn't have your grandchildren under surveillance, Mr. Torino. He doesn't know their school schedules or their extracurricular activities. What he has is an opposition research firm and a talent for psychological manipulation." The words hit Eddie like a physical blow, but not the way he expected. Relief and rage warred in his chest as 30 years of carefully constructed assumptions began to crumble. "You're telling me this was all theater?" Maria's voice was deadly quiet. "The threats, the phone call, everything?" Walsh nodded grimly. "Anthony needed you both rattled and desperate. He's been planning this for months, ever since his campaign manager discovered that certain financial records from the Calabrese organization were never properly destroyed." She paused, fixing Maria with a pointed stare. "Records that should have been turned over to federal prosecutors in 1994. Eddie felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "The cancer program, the buried evidence. How long have you known?" "Since the day Maria falsified her first report." Walsh's voice carried no judgment, only exhaustion. "Did you really think you could hide federal crimes from the Bureau indefinitely? We've been watching, waiting, hoping the situation would resolve itself without forcing our hand." Maria stepped forward, her fists clenched. "So you let me destroy my career for nothing? You let me think I'd gotten away with it while you were building a case?" We let you protect dozens of families whose children are alive today because of an experimental cancer treatment program. Walsh's voice hardened. We let you believe you were protecting Eddie because it served our purposes. But mostly, we let you live with the guilt because we needed to know who else was involved. The revelation hung in the basement air like poison gas. Eddie looked at Maria, seeing 30 years of unnecessary suffering written across her features, and felt something break inside his chest. You used her, he said quietly. You've been using both of us this entire time. The Bureau doesn't operate in moral absolutes, Mr. Torino. We operate in necessary evils. Walsh checked her watch with casual indifference. Maria's sacrifice allowed us to map the entire Calabrese money laundering operation. Her guilt made her predictable, controllable. It was unfortunate but effective. Eddie's tremor disappeared entirely as rage burned through his nervous system like cleansing fire. For 30 years, he'd carried the weight of believing he'd corrupted a federal agent, destroyed an honorable woman's career for his own desperate needs. Now he understood the truth was far worse. Maria had been a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. What do you want from us now? Maria's voice was hollow, defeated. Anthony Calabrese is going to be arrested tonight on federal racketeering charges. The evidence we've gathered over the past 3 decades will put him away for life. Walsh moved toward the tunnel entrance, examining it with professional interest. But we need your testimony to make the charges stick, both of you. The original fight-fixing conspiracy, the money laundering through the cancer program, all of it. Eddie shook his head slowly. And if we refuse? Walsh turned back to face them, and for the first time, Eddie saw something that might have been genuine, emotion cross her features. Then Anthony walks free, runs for state senate, and eventually becomes governor with all the power and connections that entails. The children who are alive today because of that cancer program will become political liabilities to be eliminated. The casual way she delivered the threat, wrapped in bureaucratic necessity and institutional logic, revealed everything Eddie needed to know about Deputy Director Catherine Walsh. This was a woman who had spent so many years manipulating lives for the greater good that she'd forgotten the difference between justice and expedience. You really believe that, don't you? Eddie said, his voice filled with something approaching pity. You really think you're the hero in this story? Walsh's composure cracked slightly. I think I'm the person who's kept you both alive for 30 years while building a case that will finally bring down one of the most dangerous criminal organizations on the East Coast. No, Eddie said quietly. You're the person who's been playing God with other people's lives because you think you're smart enough to know how the story should end. The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm 30 years in the making. Walsh's face hardened, but Eddie could see something flickering behind her eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the first crack in a worldview built on moral compromises justified as necessary sacrifices. Maria stepped forward, her voice cutting through the basement's stale air. You want our testimony? Fine, but I have conditions. You're not in a position to make demands, Walsh replied, but her tone lacked conviction. Aren't I? Maria's laugh was bitter as broken glass. You've spent 3 decades building this case on the foundation of my destroyed career and Eddie's guilt. Without us, you have financial records and circumstantial evidence. With us, you have a story that ends with Anthony Calabrese in federal prison. Eddie watched the interplay between the two women, understanding finally dawning. This wasn't about justice or the greater good. It was about legacy. Walsh needed this win, needed to prove that 30 years of manipulation and moral compromise had been worth something. What do you want? Walsh asked. The families, Maria said simply. Every child who survived because of that cancer program gets immunity, full immunity. No investigations into how their treatments were funded. No congressional hearings about dirty money saving clean lives. Walsh's composure slipped another notch. That's not how federal prosecutions work. We can't just... You can and you will, Eddie interrupted, his voice stronger than it had been in years. Because without our cooperation, your 30-year investigation becomes a footnote in Anthony Calabrese's successful political career. For the first time since entering the basement, Walsh looked genuinely rattled. She pulled out her phone, stared at the screen for a moment, then put it away without making a call. There's something else, she said slowly. "Something you both need to know before you make this decision." Maria's body tensed. "What?" "Sarah knows." Walsh's words fell like stones into still water. "Your daughter, Mr. Torino. She's known about the fight fixing for 15 years. Eddie felt the world tilt sideways. His knees buckled, and only Maria's quick reflexes kept him from hitting the concrete floor. "That's impossible. She never said—" She hired a private investigator when her first child was born. Wanted to know why her father had enough money for experimental cancer treatments when he'd been barely scraping by as a small-time boxing trainer. Walsh's voice carried a strange gentleness now. She found out about Vincent Calabrese's payments, about the fixed fights, about all of it. The revelation crashed over Eddie like a physical blow. 15 years. Sarah had known for 15 years and never said a word. Never confronted him, never demanded explanations, never. She also found out about the other children, Walsh continued, the ones whose treatments were funded the same way. She's been donating anonymously to cancer research ever since, trying to balance the scales. Maria's grip on Eddie's arm tightened. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because she's been working with us for the past 5 years, feeding us information about Anthony's political connections, his campaign financing, his plans for the cancer program records." Walsh paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "She doesn't hate you, Mr. Torino. She's been protecting you, and she's been protecting everyone else who benefited from money that came at such a terrible cost." Eddie closed his eyes, seeing his daughter's face, not as it had been during their last argument 15 years ago, but as it must be now. A woman who'd spent half her adult life carrying secrets that weren't hers to bear, making amends for choices she'd never been asked to make. "The phone call," he whispered, "when Anthony threatened my grandchildren, monitored and recorded with Sarah's cooperation." She knew he was bluffing, but she also knew you needed to hear the truth about what's been happening all these years. Walsh checked her watch again. "She's upstairs now, actually. Has been for the past 20 minutes. Eddie's head snapped up. "What?" "Sarah's here, Dad." The voice came from the top of the stairs, older than he remembered, weathered by 15 years of separation, but unmistakably his daughter's. Eddie turned, his tremor returning with a vengeance as Sarah descended into the basement that had become the crossroads of his life. She was 47 now, her dark hair streaked with premature gray that reminded him painfully of her mother. But her eyes, those were the same eyes that had looked up at him from a hospital bed 30 years ago, trusting him to find a way to save her life. "Hello, Eddie," Maria said softly, stepping back to give father and daughter space. Sarah reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, taking in the scene. The tunnel entrance, the confrontation, the weight of 3 decades worth of buried truth finally dragged into the light. "We need to talk," she said simply, "all of us, about what happens next." The basement had become a confessional, where 3 decades of buried sins hung in the stale air like incense. Eddie stared at his daughter, searching her face for traces of the child he'd once moved mountains to save, finding instead a woman who had been quietly moving mountains of her own. "How long have you been standing up there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Long enough." Sarah moved closer, and Eddie could see the cost of carrying secrets etched in the lines around her eyes. Long enough to hear Deputy Director Walsh explain how she's been orchestrating all our lives like pieces on a chessboard. Walsh stiffened. "Sarah, we agreed I would help you build a case against Anthony Calabrese." Sarah cut her off, steel entering her voice. "We didn't agree I would watch you manipulate my father and Maria like puppets for your entertainment." Eddie felt Maria's hand still gripping his arm, steadying him as the foundation of everything he thought he knew continued to crumble. "You've been working with the FBI for 5 years?" "I've been working against the Calabrese family for 15 years, Sarah corrected. "The FBI just happened to want the same thing I did, to make sure Anthony could never use what he knew about the cancer program as political leverage." The distinction hit Eddie like a revelation. His daughter hadn't been collaborating with federal authorities. She'd been using them, just as they thought they'd been using her. "The other families," he said slowly, understanding dawning. "The children who survived because of the dirty money, You've been protecting them this whole time." Sarah nodded, and Eddie saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Did you think I could live with the knowledge that my life was saved by destroying someone else's career without trying to make it right? That I could raise my children knowing other children had died because their families couldn't access the same treatments?" Maria stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, you don't owe anyone—" "I owe everyone," Sarah said fiercely. "I owe you for the sacrifice you made thinking you were protecting my father. I owe those other families for benefits that should never have been mine alone. And I owe my father the truth he's been too afraid to ask for." Eddie's tremor had spread from his hands to his entire body now, but it wasn't from fear or shame. It was from the overwhelming realization that the daughter he thought he'd lost to his own moral failures had instead spent 15 years trying to redeem choices she'd never made. "The night you called me," he said, his voice breaking. 15 years ago, when you told me you never wanted to see me again." "I had just found out about the fixed fights," Sarah admitted. "I was angry and hurt, and I didn't understand how the father who taught me about integrity could have thrown a fight for money." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "It took me years to realize you weren't fixing fights for money. You were fixing fights for me." Walsh cleared her throat impatiently. "This is very touching, but we have a situation that requires immediate resolution. Anthony Calabrese is scheduled to be arrested in 2 hours, and we need to know—" "Shut up," Eddie said quietly, but with such authority that Walsh actually stepped back. "Just shut up for 1 minute and let me talk to my daughter." He turned to Sarah, seeing her not as the disappointed child who had walked out of his life, but as the woman who had spent half her adult life trying to balance scales that should never have needed balancing. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Not for saving your life. I'll never be sorry for that. But for making you carry the weight of choices that were mine to make. For letting you think you needed to spend your life making amends for my decisions." Sarah's composure finally cracked, and she stepped forward into her father's arms for the first time in 15 years. Eddie held her tightly, feeling 30 years of accumulated guilt and shame beginning to transform into something else. Not redemption, which could never fully come, but acceptance of responsibility shared rather than borne alone. Over Sarah's shoulder, he met Maria's eyes and saw his own understanding reflected there. They had all been prisoners of a story they thought they had to carry in isolation, never realizing that the weight was meant to be shared. "What happens now?" Maria asked softly. Sarah pulled back from her father but kept hold of his hands. "Now we finish it, all of us, together." She turned to face Walsh, and Eddie saw a strength in her expression that reminded him powerfully of her mother. "We'll testify against Anthony Calabrese. We'll help you put him away, but we do it on our terms, not yours." Walsh's careful composure finally shattered completely. "You can't dictate terms to a federal investigation." "Watch us," Sarah said simply. And Eddie realized that his daughter had inherited more than just her mother's eyes. She had inherited her father's willingness to fight for what mattered most. 6 months later, Eddie stood in the doorway of his gym as the late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the boxing ring where it all began. The space felt different now, not smaller or diminished, but somehow lighter, as if 30 years of accumulated secrets had been physical weight pressing down on the rafters. The bell above the door chimed, and Maria entered carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner across the street. She moved with a confidence Eddie hadn't seen since that night in 1994 when she'd been Agent Santos, before the weight of manufactured guilt had bent her spine. "How did the hearing go?" she asked, handing him the coffee. "Anthony got 25 to life," Eddie replied, watching steam rise from his cup. Walsh testified that his organization had been laundering money through charitable programs for 3 decades. She made it sound like the Bureau had been conducting a masterful long-term investigation instead of stumbling around in the dark for 30 years. Maria's laugh carried no bitterness now, only the weary amusement of someone who had finally stopped expecting justice and started creating it instead. Let her have her narrative. The families are protected. The cancer program is legitimized under new federal oversight, and Anthony will die in prison. Sometimes the right ending matters more than the right story. Through the gym's front window, Eddie watched a group of kids from the neighborhood practice combinations on the heavy bags. Most of them came from families that couldn't afford fancy boxing clubs, just like he had 50 years ago. The circle completing itself, but cleaner this time. Honest. Sarah's bringing the grandkids by tomorrow, he said. First time they'll see the gym. What are you going to tell them about what their grandfather used to do for a living? Eddie considered the question, watching a 10-year-old girl with fierce determination work the speed bag with technique that reminded him of himself at that age. The truth, that sometimes good people make terrible choices for the right reasons, and that the real measure of a person isn't whether they fall down, but whether they help each other get back up. The door chimed again, and Sarah entered with her youngest daughter, 8-year-old Elena, who had her grandmother's eyes and her grandfather's stubborn chin. She ran straight to Eddie, who caught her in a hug that still felt miraculous after 15 years of believing it would never happen again. Grandpa Eddie, Mom says you used to train real boxers, like on TV. I did, Eddie said, kneeling down to her eye level. But the most important thing I learned wasn't about boxing. It was about family, and how sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who forgive you when you mess up really badly. Elena nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. Like when Tommy pulled my hair and I forgave him, but made him give me his dessert for a week? Exactly like that, Eddie said, catching Sarah's eye over Elena's head. His daughter smiled, not the careful, guarded expression she'd worn during their first tentative reunions, but the genuine joy he remembered from before cancer and fixed fights and buried federal evidence had torn their family apart. Maria moved to the wall where Eddie kept his old photographs. Fighters he'd trained, victories that felt important once upon a time, moments frozen in black and white before the world became complicated. She stopped in front of a new edition, a picture from the federal courthouse steps, taken the day Anthony Calabrese was sentenced. Eddie, Sarah, and Maria standing together, not celebrating exactly, but acknowledging something finished. Walsh called this morning, Maria said. She's taking early retirement, moving to Florida to be closer to her sister. Good for her, Eddie replied, meaning it. Catherine Walsh had spent 30 years believing that manipulating other people's lives made her a master strategist instead of just another damaged person trying to control things that couldn't be controlled. Retirement might teach her the difference. Sarah sat down on the bench where Eddie used to wrap fighters' hands before sending them into the ring to win or lose, based on their own skill and determination. Elena wants to learn to box, she said. I told her she'd have to ask her grandfather. Eddie looked at his granddaughter, seeing in her eager expression the same hunger he'd recognized in himself decades ago, not just to fight, but to test herself against the world and discover what she was capable of becoming. Boxing's not about hitting people, he told Elena seriously. It's about discipline and respect, and learning that being strong means protecting people who need protection. Can you teach me that? I can teach you that, Eddie said, and felt the last piece of his broken world click back into place. Outside, the Atlantic City sun was setting over the boardwalk where tourists chased ordinary dreams with honest money. Inside the gym, 3 generations prepared to begin again, carrying their scars not as shame but as proof that some stories end not with redemption, but with the harder gift of acceptance. The bell above the door chimed softly in the evening breeze, marking time that finally belonged to them.